So I was looking through some of the comments on a video I did, and somebody asked for like a guitar lesson, not about like what to play, but more of how to play it. And so I decided to do this video topic that I never even thought about before, but how to play guitar in the studio, because there are things that I noticed that I have started doing more on guitar once I've started recording that I think just uniformly apply to guitar as a whole and would help people who are trying to record themselves at home or just want to like level up their guitar a bit. And I think the reason why all this stuff culminated when I was just in my room playing guitar by myself, it didn't really matter whether I was like doing this thing or that thing. That was like kind of overall a bit of a negative in terms of the quality of my playing. But then when I played live, I needed to care a little bit more, like how cleanly was I playing this thing? And then I started recording and it really mattered, because now instead of just getting the take mostly there and we're in this room with a PA system and only a couple people heard the mistake, if that, now it's more like my exact performance on this thing is like being put on a speaker that's going into somebody's ear. Like they're very, very close to my performance. And that's where a lot of this stuff that I'm about to talk about started to take place a little bit more. I'm not going to be teaching anything crazy here, but I think these are just like fundamental stuff that most people recording guitar would do well to at least implement in some aspects. But first out of the way, I want to go over a couple of things that are small that I think just make a big difference when you're recording guitar. The first thing is pick size. I am notoriously using very, very thin picks. These are the 0.5 millimeter Tortex picks. They're from Dunlop. They have like a very papery like thwack to them. I like the bend that they have. And then I have like one size above that, like the 60 millimeter. That's the orange one. And I use these very rarely, but sometimes it's good to have like a little bit of a thicker pick. But yeah, I've just found for like acoustics or guitars just as a whole, I like a thinner pick. So here I have like a thin pick and here I have like a thick pick. If I have a thin pick and I'm picking, there's a lot of give in this. As I push through the string, there will be a bit of a flicking motion where it picks up. And then if I have a thicker pick, it doesn't really do that. And what I've found is when I'm using thicker picks, if I'm playing a little bit too hard, that tends to be what pushes stuff out of tune while I'm recording. I also find that it's harder to be like gentle and play softer, because when I have a soft pick, I can kind of control the amount of like dynamics I have depending on how hard I grip the pick. So an example of this, I'm going to play something that's really simple, just two strings here, and I'm going to play it like a slappy Cory Wong thing. I have this pick so loosely held in my hand that like if you push it like this, it will actually move a little bit. And the reason I like that is because I can use my wrist to sort of add that spank if I want it. Or I can be more gentle with it. And I can get the dynamic that way. But then if I decide to tighten it up a little bit, I can get more of like that drive just by tightening up the grip on my pick a little bit. And I find that having a looser pick, it almost adds a little bit more of a bounce or a thwap to it. Whereas a heavier pick is just going to not have that kind of give. And so you're either kind of really, really delicately holding it to try to get the softer stuff. Because if you grip it even a little bit too much, you start getting more of a dig into it. So yeah, pick thickness is really important. What brand you do doesn't matter. I like the Dunlops just because I've used them since I was a kid. Another thing that will help your guitar recording is this guy. Something that will just deaden the strings before the nut. Like if you have a guitar and you just like pick those guys, you'll know those have like a weird overtone to them. And when you're playing guitar in a recording context, I find that there's just so many times where those little stupid overtones, they just sort of ring out in this terrible like to the point where if I have a really high gain patch and I'm doing something with a lot of like stops in it, instead of having this like really harsh cut after it, there will be this sort of like overtone ring. And so I like to put like a piece of fabric or something to just like deaden it. I know some people will use like foam. This is literally like an old ripped up sock that I wasn't using anymore. And I just slide it so that these are dead. But yeah, you'll get really better results. Even on acoustic guitars, if you just like deaden this. And if you have a Strat where there's a tremolo system with like springs on the inside, you do the same thing. On the inside of this, there's actually a bunch of toilet paper that's just kind of pressed against the strings to keep it from ringing out a ton. So all of those put together, the pick, muting this, all culminate in a guitar that can do this. and not have like any ringing or weird overtones to them. It just tightens the guitar up as a whole. And next thing I want to look at is my right hand and what I'm doing most of the time with it. For me, most of the time it's in like one of three places. It is either on the bridge with like my pinkies or my fingers out. Sometimes I'll just have like my pinky sort of resting on here, or I'll just coil it up like this. But essentially I have a position on the bridge that my hand is kind of resting at, just so that while I'm like alternate picking, I like know where my hand is and what strings I'm on top of. So that's the first place that I'm normally sitting. The other one is the same, but I roll it a little bit off the bridge to do more of a palm mute thing. I think that most people need to work on their palm muting stuff because there is a fine line that you need to hit where you're deadening the string, but you're not choking it out. So to me, that's too dead. And I'm backing it. That's not dead enough. Like, I'm trying to find this medium ground between the note being dead, but then also not choking it out. So that tends to be like maybe a 1/4 inch off the bridge. It's not an exact science. I'm normally just feeling it out. And then depending on whether I'm on the lower strings or the higher strings, that is kind of like moving back and forth. And then the third way that I'm normally playing it is where my hand is just like off. Like if I know I want just like a slappiness and a power, I'll just take my hand off the bridge. So already how I'm using my right hand is determining a lot of the dynamics of how I'm actually playing the part. The next thing is the left hand. Now I already made a video about like how to like arrange stuff for pop guitar. So I'm not really going to talk about like chord shapes or scales or things like that. You can just go watch that video. But one thing that I do think is really important in terms of being able to record stuff is how good are you at muting the strings that you're not playing. And it's a really like beginner concept. Everybody learns about it. But like in recording, it becomes super important. So like if I'm playing this, I'm playing these two top strings, like all of the other strings, I'm muting with the rest of my hand. Same story here. I have this shape that I use a lot. Like when I'm playing this is a C major 7 without the 5th. So it's on the A string, the G string, and the B string. All of the other strings are being muted in different ways. So right here, this finger is holding down the C, but it's also kind of butting up against the E string just so that string is a little bit more muted. I've also arched it so that it's muting the D string. And then my pinky here on the E is actually leaning over so that the high E string is muted. I'll turn off the gain so you can hear it. So if I just pick through this chord one note at a time on all strings, like you can hear it's dead, held out, dead, held out, held out, dead. Like so much of how you're positioning your left hand, at least for me when I'm recording parts, is based around like, how do I mute this correctly? Like first thing is what notes am I holding? And the second is how am I muting everything that I'm not playing right now? This is another sort of 7th shape without the 5th. 1st, 7th, 3rd. So G sharp, major 7 without the 5th, whatever. And again, it's like the notes are held out, dead string next to it being held down by that same finger, open note, dead note, dead note. And I feel like that's also part of why stuff can be really slappy and aggressive, is because if I'm not muting these strings, I then have to sort of play it in a way where I'm like not swinging and giving the thing my full force with my right hand. Like part of why I love these shapes is because I can just slap them. Like I'm digging in really hard on all the strings, and I can do that because I've muted them all. I'm gonna try to play this incorrectly. Like if I try to like control it by just not picking hard enough in either direction to where I'm hitting those strings that I'm normally muting, the take just sounds bad. Like that's as much as I can give it while not hitting strings that I'm not muting. Whereas if I'm just by default with my left hand muting everything, I can actually give it like my full force. This also goes into lead line stuff, not just chords. So to describe what I'm talking about, here's like a lead line. So some things that I'm doing right here is I'm sliding up on this string and then going to the next string over and playing those next two notes. When I'm at the end of this on this string, I'm lifting up my finger and immediately killing that note. And I'm trying to have that switch off be really clean. So it's not like this, where they like bleed into each other. And I'm also not letting it die out quickly. You can hear where there's like a stop and then the next string. This is probably what I hear the most from people who I tell like muting is important. They'll like cut off the end of a note before going into the next one. So you can hear when I jump strings, it's like, there's like a little bit of a gap between the two of them. Something that I try to do when I'm recording stuff like this is I just try to have it be as legato as possible. And I might even get really picky about what takes I think are good from that. That one's pretty good. Those two bleeded into each other a little bit more. I think a string subtly ringed out on that one. And like this is like the neurotic side of recording guitar is like you just have all these things that you need to manage while you're playing. You start to see the guitar this way permanently. And even if you have something where there is like a syncopation to it, you can still hear like what it sounds like to have like the gap between the chord change versus something that just kind of naturally flows. Like even when you're using chords, you can still have a legato feel that goes between everything. So like if I had to come up with a lead line right now, like sounds very Weezer-esque. My default is to be like, okay, immediately mute that string that I'm not playing anymore. Mute it again when I go to the next string. I've moved my right hand over all of these strings that I'm not playing just to keep the noise down. So out of tune, sounds so terrible. You get what I'm saying? Like, you start to construct your parts around playing them cleanly. And I think one of the biggest drawbacks that I see with guitar performances that I get, that I have to mix or that I have to edit, is that because they're not muting properly, either strings are ringing out when they shouldn't be, or in order to avoid strings ringing out, they're just kind of not giving it their all on their right hand. So I think one of the biggest ways for you to see improvement in your guitar playing and your recordings in general is really pay attention to, am I playing this cleanly? Are there any strings ringing out? When I'm doing something like, am I actually muting all these guys that I don't want to be ringing out? And am I actually giving it like my full force with my right hand? Because I will say that is the one thing where, as an audio engineer and a producer, if somebody is like lightly like sort of like daintily picking at it because they don't want it to like hit other strings, there's nothing I can do to make that sound like this. Like the actual performance isn't there. And it's the same thing as vocals. Like with auto-tune and vocal line, like yes, you can edit a vocal, but you can't take somebody going like, and make it sound like Celine Dion singing in her full chest voice, because the energy isn't there in the actual performance. And so I translate that thought process onto guitar. Is the actual core performance what I need it to be for what I'm trying to do? Those are the main concepts that I think are specific to like recording guitar that are important. Again, I already did a long video about how to actually like play different parts in an arrangement where there's a lot of guitars. So yeah, hopefully you guys found this video helpful. I will be seeing you guys next week.